and we're gonna bring on our next guest. We're gonna start with Ariel Cohen. How you doing,
Hey,
Ariel?
good. Matt Harvey, let's not talk about him. What is this? Stagger
Come
to the
on, I
heart
don't
of
want to talk
Mets
about Matt
fans.
Harvey. I got all these guys. I missed Luke Weaver, for heaven's sake. Okay. All right, Christian Javier. You wanted me to spend more time on Matt Harvey, Ariel. Get out of here.
Just kidding. How you doing, Nick?
Oh, I'm doing all right, man. Thank you so much for being a part of this. It does seem, by the way, the heads up to everybody. Unfortunately, the last moment, Derek Hardy could not make it for this. He's torn up about it. It's just how it goes sometimes. It's really hard to schedule. 85 people or whatever it is going to happen. But Derek, thank you so much anyway for he donated a subscription to Bad X as part of the prize pool. So thank you so much, Derek. And we're gonna move on here to Jeremy Frank. What's up, Jeremy?
Hey, how's it going, guys?
It's it's gone all right so far. You tell me. I don't know. I just ranted for 100 pitchers or whatever. I have no idea what's going on. But yeah, thank you so much for being here for another year, Jeremy.
Oh yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on. This is always a blast.
Absolutely. And lastly, we have Jeremy Siegel here. Jeremy,
Hey,
welcome.
how's it going?
Good. Yeah, Jeremy, writer here at Pitcher List, data science team, as well as the writing a lot of going deeps, just very infused with data. So I think actually you wrote one of the boot camp articles. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. I wrote a article about basically a tutorial about how to do a basic player projection model with R. So you should definitely check that out.
That's awesome. Well, anyway, guys, thanks so much for being here for this. The data of baseball. I'll let you guys go to it.
All right. Thanks again, Nick. Nice to be back at PitchCon 2022. Now in its third year. The conference started with the pitcher list roundtable as usual, and Nick Pollock did his thing for an hour. And as tradition, I'm on right after Nick for the third hour. Fantastic tradition. Thank you so much for having me on right after you. It's a tough act to follow. But we got a great hour for everybody here, and we're going to be supporting Feeding America. If you haven't donated, please do so right now. And you can win some prizes, and it's just great to donate to a great organization. This hour is called The Data of Baseball, and we're going to talk a little bit about data science, some machine learning, Cy Young Awards, Statcast data, maybe a little bit about the Houston Astros scandal, and we'll talk about projections, of course. We know Derek Carty was supposed to join us, not going to be able to do that, so we'll miss him. But let's just introduce who we have on here. First, we have Jeremy Siegel. He can be found on Twitter at JERSIEGS, Jer Siegs. He's a writer and data science staffer for Pitcher List. Why don't you introduce yourself, Jeremy?
Yeah, you said it best. I do not work for a professional baseball team, and I don't have my own publicly available projection system, but I am a pretty big data-driven guy pretty much my entire life. I'm currently finishing up my last semester of college at the University of Pittsburgh and with a major in computer science statistics. So data is pretty much my strength and my passion.
Nice. What's your favorite number, by the way?
14.
Wow. All right. Interesting number. Mine is some square root. Anyways, let's introduce Jeremy Frank at MLB Random Stats. Why don't you introduce yourself? You work for Baseball Reference and going to be working for a major league organization later this summer. That sounds cool. Bring out your trash cans for this one.
Ha ha ha. Very funny. But yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm on Twitter at MLB Random Stats. I started my page as a freshman in high school, and it's kind of grown since then. Also, I apologize. My Wi-Fi is really bad right now, so if I'm cutting out or I miss something you say, I'm very sorry. My apartment Wi-Fi is not very good. But yeah, as you mentioned, I've been an intern at Sports Reference, which is like the host of Baseball Reference, Basketball Reference, etc. Since last May, and then this upcoming May, I'll transition to the Astros research and development team as an intern. So I'm really excited for that. I'm currently a student at Purdue. I'm a junior studying data science. So similar to other Jeremy, I think we have pretty similar interests. But yeah, that's pretty much all about me.
Awesome. Fantastic. So it's going to get a little confusing when we have Jeremy and Jeremy. So if you guys don't mind, maybe I'll call you by your last names for the hour, Frank and Siegel. Is that okay? Yeah?
Yeah, that's good with me.
All right, sounds good. First, want to talk a little bit about, the title again of this hour is The Data of Baseball, and talking about data science and analytics in general. And before we start diving into some of it, um, can we talk a little bit about how the introduction of analytics and data science really affected baseball in generally, both positively and negatively? Let's start with you, Mr. Siegel.
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, well, how do you think that the introduction of analytics and data science has affected baseball, either for the teams, for the fans, or in general for the sport, both positively and negatively?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, data is just information. So more data is always a good thing. It really comes down to how you analyze that data and how you use your findings from that data. I think when Moneyball came out, I forget exactly what year it was, but I think that had a very positive impact on how data was publicly, or how using analytics in baseball was publicly perceived. Um, I honestly have a lot of trouble thinking of a negative that data science has in baseball because, as I said, data is essentially just information, and more information is always good.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of negatively, I mean, there's positives and negatives for the fans. I mean, certainly it's changed the game. You talked about, you mentioned Moneyball. OBP is king. That's really what the theme of Moneyball was, and they found the advantage in the game that they're underpriced. These OBP guys, they're much better than you think, and let's just rig that sort of thinking. And it may not be OBP today. It might be some power hitters. It might be some relievers. It might be some guys who have a weird arm delivery. Whatever specific advantage the analytics has gotten, it's really told you, hey, let's be efficient with our money and let's invest more money in this because it's good bang for the buck. But it's led to stuff in baseball. Now, you have the shifts because of it in baseball because it says, hey, if you shift, it's going to be a better fielding situation. You'll take away hits, but that's produced less hitting in baseball. There's less stealing in baseball because statistics say, hey, stealing doesn't produce more expected runs unless you have a success rate over like 84%. So in that way, maybe the fans suffer somewhat in that the game has changed, maybe for the worse in terms of viewership. But I'm with you in terms of the data that, I go onto Fangraphs page and now you can see why a player is good and how it's good, component driven. And we play fantasy baseball, right? That's what it's about. We want to find an advantage in players to say, hey, if I was a GM, I'm going to pinpoint a good advantage, and it makes it fun for us to pretend that we're running the organization. So there's good and bad in that way. Frank, how would you perceive things?
Yeah, I kind of agree with the other Jeremy stance, and I think that from like a front office perspective, I think more data is always a good thing. But then you kind of look at it in the other way in terms of baseball is primarily supposed to be an entertainment business, and I think that over the last decade or so, while they've definitely improved team efficiency and stuff, may not always lead to the first and foremost like priorities for the fans. So I think that there are definitely some good things that people will point to. But also, like you mentioned, the shift, I think, is one thing that people may not really like to see when they're watching a game, but they also have to recognize that it's the strategy that wins the most baseball games. So I think that if you're a team, your job is obviously to use as much data, in my opinion, as possible, because it'll lead to as many wins as you can get out of your roster or out of your payroll. But then the league kind of has to look at it as a different way and try to look at how the rules are set. I don't think banning the shift is necessarily a good idea, but kind of how the games are getting longer, because there would be some like indications that changing pitchers more often is better for winning games, which is true. But at the same time, games are getting half an hour longer each decade, and it seems like a lot of people are kind of getting pushed away. So I think the league, they I guess, prioritize things in terms of whether they're looking at for teams winning as many games as possible, but for the league trying to get as much money as they can from fans as possible.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate to give both sides of the coin, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot to gain from data here. I want to talk a little bit about machine learning. From the way I see it, here's how I perceive what machine learning really is, how do you train a computer to recognize what a dog is? Like a picture. Like here's a picture. Computer, tell me, is this a dog? And what computers programmers did at first is they said, all right, well, let's make rules. Well, it has to have 2 eyes, and it has to have a certain nose and a certain color difference and a paw, and right. And they gave it rules. And I guess that kind of reasoning could work if you have really, really good rules that you program in. But it really is it's hard to program any new kind of situation. Like here's a different kind of dog. Computers have a hard time doing it. So machine learning works a little bit differently. It doesn't give rules. It actually gives, here are pictures of dogs. There's a database of 1 million pictures of what a dog is. And there's a database of 1 million pictures what a bus looks like, and a picture what a baseball bat looks like, and a couple pictures of Paul Sporer, so that the computer can recognize, what things are. And then you give it a new picture and it comes up with a similarity score. It says, oh, it's 97% similar to a dog. I think it's a dog. And it's great because it builds upon it, because now you recognize that's a dog. You add that to your database and go on and so forth. That type of thing is happening in baseball. Maybe you can tell us how machine learning is applied to baseball, how baseball data is captured in general, how the tools and technologies are taking it, and sort of a little bit how the analyzation process works. So let's start with you, Frank.
Yeah, so I think your analogy for machine learning was pretty strong with the dogs, and I think you can kind of look at it in a similar way for baseball. I think that if you're a front office and you're going into players as you can, that's going to potentially help your major league team down the road. And most of the players you draft, especially after the first few rounds, don't really end up being significant contributors. You'll find one in a while that ends up being a great player, but most of them end up being maybe career minor leaguers for the most part. But you can kind of look at machine learning is when you're looking at pictures of dogs and saying, or like a cat, and say, is this a dog? No, a cat's not a dog. But you can also use the same thing looking at a bunch of players that you could potentially select in the draft. Say, is cut and dry as, is this picture a dog or a cat? It's more kind of a subjective kind of thing, looking at their high school stats or their college stats, their quality of competition, etc. But just from getting all of that information and comparing it to quite literally tens of thousands of players that have been drafted in the past and having a good idea of how their careers ended up, you can have a decent idea, if you have a strong model and a strong way of setting it up, of which players are going to be better off for your organization, or what kind of players are going to be better fits than others. So it's kind of like, it's a little college drafty or high school drafty and saying, is this player going to be a major league player 6 years in advance? So I think that's one example of how machine learning can kind of be applied in baseball similarly to how it is on your iPhone or whatever.
Right. Anything to add to that, Siegel?
Yeah, just building off what Frank just said. Think about how many players there have been in the history of baseball. Even if you take minors and college out of it, think about how many players there have been in the history of Major League Baseball, and then think about how much data is available on those players, whether you want to go to Baseball Reference or Fangraphs or Baseball Savant or Brooks Baseball. They all offer a different collection of stats on those players. And if you want to gather a huge database of all those stats on all those players, and you want to create a model that looks at the trends of certain stats and how they lead to better performance in the future, how are you going to do that on your own without the use of some kind of automated system? And that's essentially how machine learning ties into baseball and how it's important.
Yeah. I can talk about projection systems, and I know Baseball Perspective, Pacoda system does this. I think the Zip system, Dan Zamborski, that I'm going to talk to him later this week on my show, there's similarity scores. What they do is, how do you know how a player is going to do? You take a bunch of players and you have a large database of how they are now, what their history was, and there's a trajectory on how they perform. And it's all similarity scores. And the more and more elements you add to it, and the more gather, and computers can gather and add more information to a bank, the more and more accurate you're going to be later on. And that's what it does in terms of projections. So, going back to front office discussion, how is this kind of learning, machine learning, and just maybe in general, talk about how front offices use data and analytics? Like, the data is captured. You have the Hawkeye system, and there's systems, or there's electronic stuff put in all stadiums that you can capture the speed of a runner, the speed of outfielders running, and the path they take to a ball, and how efficient is their path. Just incredible stuff. Maybe you guys can tell us what front offices do with this type of stuff, how they analyze it, and how it actually leads to some decision making. Let's start with you, Frank.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are kind of work with it. It's not just a player's batting average or their sprint speed or how hard they can throw the ball from shortstop to first base or whatever. But that information, like, it's not, someone has to, like you said, kind of measure it. So what these teams are doing is they're getting these very large files from the tracking system, the Hawkeye system that's installed in each Major League ballpark. And basically what this system is, I'm not a huge expert in it, but essentially every split second of an entire 3-hour baseball game, it's taking a picture of essentially where everything is on the field, where the baseball is, where each player's feet are, where their elbows are, and et cetera, like that. So at the end of each game, they get this extremely large file. And before they even can figure out how hard these guys are throwing or how fast they're running, they have to figure out what they're going to do with all of these little data points of where everything is on the field. They have to turn the ball was here, and then half a second later it was here, to, okay, that ball was thrown 94 miles per hour. So I think a lot of the challenges front offices face is not just using the data to like in a smart way, but even just managing the data from a really unreadable data file to something that they can do something with. And then once they have all that information, it's almost an easier task, I would say. Obviously, I'm not an expert, but I think a lot of the challenges they face is just storing the data and figuring out what is even meaningful before they even can apply it to decision making.
All right. Anything to add, Siegel?
Yeah, I think one thing that we need to remember is what I mentioned earlier about how much baseball data there is publicly available. MLB front offices have access to even more complex data than that. So they can they can look at, as Jeremy Frank just mentioned, like where a player's elbow is at a certain time and where the ball is, and use that to, or I mean, I'm guessing that really doesn't have much of an effect on how good a player is, but they can use a machine learning model to tell them whether or not it does. And there are certain, I mean, I've never worked in a front office or anything, so I'm not exactly sure what kinds of data they look at to analyze trends, but I do know that they have access to way more data than we do, and they can do even more cool stuff than what you've probably seen on the internet.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and going off of that, I think one of the most useful things with like the new Hawkeye, because before Hawkeye there was a different system installed, but Hawkeye has like the ability to track like every like different limb of a player, which is kind of weird to me. But one of the main benefits of that, because like you said, Jeremy, it probably doesn't matter where a player's elbow is for like the entire game. It doesn't really tell you anything about the player, but it's really, really useful for injury detection and prevention, because you can tell if a pitcher, for example, slightly moves his hand down a little bit. It could be because he's easing the tension of his elbow, because his body knows before he does that his elbow's about to be hurt. So you want to see that in real time and be able to recognize that, hey, like this guy's pitching like he's about to get hurt. Like maybe we should look into this. So that's one of the most useful things I think is with those the new tracking system that Hawkeye has, is that it can really, if you know how to use this information, if you have a data scientist paired with someone who actually knows like how bodies work, you can really get useful information for when a player might actually get hurt and save them a few months of recovery by taking them out before it actually.
Wow. And that sounds amazingly powerful, to have the ability to spot injury. I mean, we do projections and just predicting injuries and saying, wait a minute, be cautious with somebody. Wow, that's hugely powerful. It's incredible. We as the fans and us who are watching PitchCon, maybe the more average fan in terms of data science, we don't have access to all this stuff. Maybe let's talk a little bit about what we do have access to and where to get it online, so that, all of us can work on, hey, we can still find out stuff and unleash some untapped power on our end. Maybe Siegel, why don't you start and just tell us where you get your data from, and where fans like us can also do some work.
Yeah, I briefly alluded to these websites before. Fangraphs is a very popular one. Baseball Reference, both. I like both of these a lot because it's very easy to export their data into an Excel file. And I do a lot of work with Excel. And if you want to work with baseball data, I would recommend using Excel or learning Excel if you're not so strong in it. I'd say my favorite baseball data tool online is probably the Statcast search tool, because there are so many different filters you can use. For example, if you want to know what Juan Soto's WOBA is on pitches up in the zone on Wednesdays, you could do that. Like there's and there are so many more filters that you can look at. And so sometimes sometimes it's just for fun. If you want to find a fun stat, I know Jeremy Frank, his Twitter handle is literally MLB Random Stats. I'm sure he uses that and Baseball Reference to find all the random stats that don't really mean anything but are cool.
Yeah. By the way, before we go to Frank, Siegel, how many on average per day? How many Excel workbooks do you have open on your computer at any one time?
I don't know if I can count that, honestly. Like double digits for sure.
Wow. What about you, Frank?
Oh man, I don't know. It during baseball season, it's definitely more than during the off season, but it probably gets up there once in a while.
Wow. Well, unbelievable. Yeah. How about you? Anything to add, Frank, on where us, the more casual, non-hired by professional organizations people can get some data?
I think Jeremy touched on them all pretty much. As someone who is currently employed by Baseball Reference, I would definitely recommend Baseball Reference as your first and foremost research tool. I think the StatHead tool that Baseball Reference offers is really interesting. I think basically my Twitter account was basically like only using the Baseball Reference play index, what it used to be, to find these like very random stats, like players to hit 3 different milestones in a season or something that no one's done in 100 years or whatever. And you can kind of do all of that with without really any need to know how to use Excel, even just as long as you know what you're looking for. But like he said, I think Baseball Savant is really useful. It's really nice how much of the data they make public for people to be able to use. A lot of people who have like the combination of being able to know what they're looking for and also some decent coding knowledge. A lot of people have made some really cool things using pitch tracking data and have subsequently been hired by MLB teams pretty much right after they release their findings or whatever, because a lot of these things, there's only so many people that work in front offices, and there are also a lot of equally qualified people that are just doing it for fun. So you can do a lot of cool things with the information that's publicly available. Obviously, like we've kind of alluded to, the teams have way more information than we do, but compared to other sports, I like to think baseball's kind of ahead of all the other sports in terms of data compared to like football or basketball or whatever.
Yeah. And Brooks Baseball, another good site. If you haven't checked that one out, do. And I am employed by Fangraphs, so I'll also recommend to go to Fangraphs too. Why not, right? Frank, you are going to be working for the Houston Astros. And we mentioned before at the start of the show, talk a little bit about the Astros scandal. Somewhat involves data, somewhat involves technology. First, what kind of role did you have in? I'm kidding, but just kidding about that. But yeah, why don't you can you just talk a little bit about what the scandal was involved in and how some of the data came to be and what it has to do with data at all?
Yeah, so my understanding, this was like probably like what 5 years ago now or whatever. But my understanding is that they had this kind of machine learning program set up, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. And during their home games, they would look in from like a center field wall or whatever and see what signs the catcher was giving their pitcher. And just from a few different at bats, having seen, like he did this like this sequence of numbers and then it was a changeup, or then this sequence of numbers and it was a fastball, you can very easily deduce using a very powerful like machine learning like algorithm or whatever to determine, okay, then he just gave this symbol, what's it going to be? So then once they were able to figure that out just from a few samples of pitches, because that's really all you need to figure out, it's not like they're using like advanced cryptography to relay their signs from catcher to pitcher. It's relatively simple for the most part. But once they were able to figure that out, they were able to transmit to their hitters before the pitch was even thrown what pitch it was going to be. So obviously, while this was definitely a violation of the morals and ethics of the game, it's kind of fascinating machine learning wise how they were able to gain an advantage. Not like I definitely don't condone that. What they did was definitely wrong, but it is also kind of fascinating that they were able to gain that kind of advantage using data in a way that obviously it shouldn't be used. But nonetheless, it was an example of how data has affected the game.
Right. So you appreciate the complexity of the sneakiness that they were doing. I love it. I love it. How has baseball data, changed either some baseball rules today? We talked about like the aspects like shifting and all that, but how has it actually physically changed baseball rules, or how is it attempting to change some rules? And maybe even how has baseball data affected awards voting? That for sure is true. Let's start with you, Siegel. What say you?
Jeremy Frank mentioned this earlier that there's a lot of data that shows that using as many pitchers as possible or pulling pitchers early can be advantageous, especially if you don't have an ace like a Jacob deGrom or Garrett Cole. And 2 years ago, MLB implemented a 3-batter minimum for relievers. And I think that has a lot to do with data because the number of pitchers used per game has increased significantly over the last 10, 15 years. And also for awards, there are like a lot of awards voters who will mention a player's WAR or their WRC plus for why they voted for them for MVP, or maybe Gold Gloves. Maybe they'll cite defensive runs saved or other defensive metrics that are out there where 20 years ago you would probably never hear this term. And I'd say as far as award snubs go, we like to complain about them every year, but if you look back, they're a lot more back then than there are now.
Yeah, I mean, Jacob deGrom, 2018, he won the Cy Young Award, only won 10 games. I mean,
yeah, there you go. It's a perfect example.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key one. It's my Mets over there, and by the way, I am not a Jacob deGrom fan. We in my family, we actually do not like Jacob deGrom because when my wife took my kids to spring training, Jacob deGrom snubbed them, and hey, can I have an autograph? No, and goodbye. You know who did come over and spent like 15 minutes and signed like 5 balls? Matt Harvey. That's right, Matt Harvey, the Dark Knight. Nice guy. And Brandon Nimmo. Brandon Nimmo is such a nice dude. Love that guy. All right. Anyways, what about you, Frank? Anything to add to the either the rules or the awards and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing that wasn't mentioned, I think Jeremy put it pretty well with award votings and how it's kind of been much more correlated to advanced metrics than UC. But besides that, one thing that's quite timely right now actually is that there are reports that during the CBA discussions between the players and the owners, that both sides are kind of looking to add some kind of salary incentive or some way of I don't know exactly how it would be, but they were pretty much saying that they would tie some player salary incentive to their WAR. Like if they hit a certain WAR threshold and they were like on the rookie deal, that would be one way that they can outplay the minimum contract or whatever, which in my opinion is a terrible idea because it just opens up a huge can of worms for how, like, there's never really been a time where right now currently you're not allowed to tie any contracts to anything relatively, like anything related to performance. Like you can tie it to plate appearances or innings pitched, but you can't tie it to how many home runs a player hits or how many bases they steal, because that would kind of change the way the player plays the game, because it's potentially they could be going for bonuses in terms of milestones instead of trying to win the game. And obviously WAR is a little better in that there are many different ways you can increase your WAR, but at the same time, while WAR is a very strong stat, it's not perfect. And I think tying a player's like there's a lot of money at stake for how much money these players could potentially make. And I think that tying it to a good but albeit approximate stat is just not a good idea. As someone who, I mean, there's a huge debate between among some people about whether Baseball Reference's WAR is better than Fangraphs' WAR or Baseball Prospectus's WAR. When you choose one of them to look at, you're inherently saying that one of them is better and that those skills should fit for his pitcher. You're telling their pitchers that they should be selling out for the FIP aspects of their game. They should be giving, I mean, obviously, generally striking out guys is better and walking fewer guys is better, but there's also ways you can kind of sell out in that kind of way that wouldn't necessarily make you a better pitcher, but you can get your FIP better. Obviously, it's not super easy or whatever, but there are ways to sell out for certain metrics that are prioritized, just like for Baseball Reference WAR, which is kind of it kind of favors runs against, because the way Baseball Reference WAR works is that it looks at all runs you allow, whether they're earned or not. So there's just so many different reasons why it's a bad idea. But it would be really interesting to see if you have players who are trying to get 0.2 more WAR in their last 2 weeks of the season because they have $1 million incentivized for it. Like, how are they going to play differently? It's just a really weird way of doing things.
Yeah, that is an amazing point that you just made, that the danger of some of these statistics is that you can overuse them or you can tailor your play. If we know that incentives are on FIP, well, you can tailor your game. That is 100% true. I mean, at my job at work, I don't want to have a one-size-fits-all metric of this is the best player, this is the best option that I want to buy for my insurance investment. The statistics are great to use as a comparison relative to another, but you also have to know the flaws in them in order to describe them. You have to know what the good things about them. And when you give a couple different options, I like the human element of picking it out, right? So the statistics are important to lay out, understand them, and then make the human element. And by the way, Frank, you and I will go outside and back to debate B WAR versus F WAR after this. Okay, sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right. I have a couple of questions here that have popped up on Twitch, so let's get to them. Part of our Q&A. 2 questions in a row. Milkman asked, "Can you discuss what the impact of statistics on things like a shift? What about unquantifiable metrics such as a clubhouse leader and veteran presence?" Okay. And Truckee asks, "What, if any, rule changes would you guys suggest to address some entertainment or even fairness issues of the shift, robo-umps, and so on and so forth?" I mean, as far as the robo-umps and fairness, theoretically, things will be fair for everybody, but just as Frank just clearly mentioned, there are issues. If you know that there's an optimal way for one thing, that's sort of a problem. As far as the unquantifiable metrics, hopefully they're left unquantifiable. Any thoughts, guys? Siegel, maybe first?
You kind of asked 2 questions at once, so I'm gonna go with the first one. So I guess we kind of talked about the shift a lot earlier. I personally don't really see need to ban the shift. I think the problem that many people have with the shift is that it goes against the traditional norms of baseball that you have 9 players and they're all in set positions. But I always like to say, if baseball started 20 years ago and we had access to the kinds of data that we had when baseball started, or that we had, if we had access to the baseball we have now when baseball started, people would be shifting like it's nothing. And I don't think there would be as much public complaining, because you would see it as, okay, you have a pitcher and you have a catcher, and then you have 7 position players that you can position wherever they want. There's doesn't have to be a set second baseman, shortstop, third baseman, center fielder, right fielder, left fielder. Like, I think the shift is just a representation of that concept. And I'm not really sure. I don't really think that that's necessarily a bad thing. As far as clubhouse leaders and veteran presence goes, obviously that's very difficult to quantify. I don't think that there's anybody out there that will tell you that those things don't exist, because they probably do. And obviously none of us have played for a major league baseball team. So how are we to tell you that they're not real?
Yeah, no doubt. Frank, anything to add on that?
Yeah, it's really funny, kind of going off what Siegel said about the shift and a lot of other rule changes, is that by kind of there's like 3 different trains of thought. There's like one who's like, oh, like we should like let the data determine what teams do, and like I think that's where a lot of people who are watching this stream would probably come from. But then there are 2 other groups of people. The one who loves baseball because it's of its history of not really changing things, and how it's kind of a free for all, kind of do whatever you think thing. And that's kind of like, I feel like, a minority of kind of the older group of fans who just don't like regulations on the game. And those people you would think would probably be for keeping the shift, because it's pure baseball. We shouldn't have to add new rules that didn't exist 50 years ago, because that's just different than what it was. But then there's the other group of old school fans who says they didn't shift 50 years ago. Like, we need to get this out of the game because I want to look like what it did when I was a kid. So it's kind of tough to please everyone in this situation, because you have, not only do you have 2 different sides where it's just analytics versus not analytics, it's how do you want to the way to make the game look like how it used to, if that's something you're going after, is by adding rules that didn't exist. And a lot of people love baseball because there are so many different ways you can be a good baseball player, you can be a good baseball team. I think the diversity of how teams do things, in my opinion, is kind of the beauty of baseball, about how you can just have so many different good baseball players that are totally different looking players. And same with teams, with just how many different strategies they can employ and have a winning team. But I think it's really tough, like I kind of was talking about earlier, just for the league to balance what it prioritizes. Does it prioritize the hands-off kind of way of playing baseball, or does it want to add rules to make it sacrificing, I think, what I would say is one of the things that makes baseball such a fun sport.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of all these things, teams and data and statistics and all that, teams have to, in the end of the day, decide if they're going to pay a player, how much they're going to pay a player. They got to somehow put a quantity on it. And whether the owner says, yeah, just add another 100,000 and another million for market value, they have to have some kind of base thing to put it there, to say value and money. And so, the element of statistics is always going to be there, whether you have the human element or not. By the way, thanks to Nick Pollock. And I shouldn't have asked 2 questions in a row, because he very nicely put those questions at the bottom. I didn't know he was going to do that. So thanks, Nick. I see you're watching here. Anyways, let's go on with our discussion here. Talk a little bit about statistics and Statcast and stuff like that. But before we talk about Statcast, what are your guys' favorite classical statistics? Is it batting average? Is it strikeouts? What is it? Siegel?
I'd say my favorite non-advanced statistic is definitely walk rate. I think there's a lot of a player's walk rate can tell you about who he is. Even in a small sample size, a player's walk rate could have a pretty big indication of how disciplined they are at the plate. And of all the basic stats, it has among the strongest correlation with future success.
Right. Frank, yours?
Yeah, I think walk
Well,
rate's great, not only just for hitters, but also for pitchers. I think that's just like one stat that kind of, sorry, I think walk rate's also great because it for hitters and for pitchers both, because it generally, like, not only just for hitters, but it also correlates really strongly towards pitcher success, is just avoiding walks, because walks are just kind of like they're like the turnovers of, like, if the basketball equivalent of turnovers is for baseball, it's kind of like walks, just giving free passes to the other team. And obviously you can get better at drawing walks, which is generally good for your team. But I think another stat, if you're going really like basic, I really like innings pitched. I think people kind of overlook that sometimes. Not everyone. I think everyone sees it differently when you have a Cy Young race or whatever. But I think, I mean, you have to cover 162 games of 9 innings apiece, and I think an underrated skill set is being able to pitch a little bit deeper into games. Obviously, like, if you're not as effective as a relief pitcher, it's not worth keeping you out. But if you can be as effective as a middle relief pitcher is, being able to go a little bit further into games and save your relief pitchers valuable innings is really good from not just an individual like performance aspect, but also in terms of helping your team stay rested and being able to stay strong for the future.
Yeah, OBP I think is awesome. How about OPS? You know, my dad claims, he tells me that he came up with OPS independently. He says he probably should have submitted it in somewhere, but he was saying, you know what, OBP is important, but it doesn't take into account, doubles and triples. We should somehow add it. And he said, oh, I came up with that kind of thing, and damn, I should have submitted it. When I was a kid, a little story. When I was a kid, my dad, a Met fan, old New York Giants fan, Willie Mays was his favorite player. And I don't know, we're watching a game late 80s, 1989, late in the season, and my dad is looking, Howard Johnson, one of his favorite players on the Mets. Yeah. All right, he got a double. And he says, Ariel, Howard Johnson just won the extra base hit percentage award. And I don't know,
Nice.
I thought that there was actually an award handed out for highest extra base hit percentage. I didn't know that. That was just my dad tracking that fun statistic for him, because he thought that extra base hit percentage was important. And when I was in 8th grade, I was like 12 years old. He had me, I just learned programming, and I made some kind of thing. And he's like, we got to make a database. We got to have things that track weird statistics. So he came up with extra base hit percentage plus walk rate, extra base hit percentage minus strikeout rate. And I would come up with the leaderboards, minimum 10,000 at bats and 100 homers, and who are the leaders. And he had me do that. And I guess it was like a precursor to Fangraphs, if he would have somehow marketed it. But fun story about my dad and statistics. Moving on to like Statcast and some new age stuff. What are your favorite Statcast statistics, and why, and anything you want to say about Statcast in general? Let's start with you, Frank.
I'm a big fan in terms of, I like everything Statcast, but I think the number one thing I'm most fascinated by is all the defensive stats. I don't think any of them are perfect yet, but I think the biggest area that the public metrics have been lacking in over the last however many years is the ability to accurately quantify how good someone is at defense. And I think a lot of especially for the outfield ones, I think the outfield ones are probably better than the infield ones are right now for Statcast, but they're really fascinating. If you look at, this ball was hit 50 feet away from this center fielder, and it's going to land in 3 seconds. Like, what's the probability that an average player catches it? And did this player catch the ball? If you look at those, every single fly ball hit to a fielder over a course of the season, you have a really good idea of how strong of a defender they are. So I think having that, I think there was kind of a little bit of, not like a guessing game, but it was more of an estimate than anything. I think still currently we're at the place where it's still not an exact science, but I think Statcast gives the ability to really more accurately figure out how good a defender is, and not even just that, but how well different defenders play together, like a center field left field combo, how good they are at getting balls in the gap and stuff like that. So I think that's what I'm most fascinated about by Statcast.
Yeah, that's funny. I was having dinner with Nate Silver a couple years ago, and he's now much more into basketball than he is into baseball. And that actually is the biggest thing. Like the Golden State Warriors were saying, okay, this player is good, but we want to look at it in terms of player pairs. Which two players do we think are gonna do the best? And they have some kind of Statcast version in basketball. And all right, this guy has a great pass and velocity here of the ball and moving and to find pairs. I thought that was interesting in basketball. For me, barrel rate is just interesting. It's plain and simple, and I love this stuff because it just directly takes physics into account and puts it into a baseball context. Like xWOBA is an xstat. It can predict your WOBA. How? Just by the velocity of the ball that you hit it and what angle you hit it at. It just those two things can actually be a good predictor as to how you're going to perform on a baseball field. It's just phenomenal in my mind. How about you, Siegel? What's your favorite?
So I was actually going to say barrels as well. I think we all know that baseball is a game that involves a lot of luck. You can hit the ball on the screws and it can go right at the fielder, or you can hit a weak grounder that happens to go right down the third base line and it's a base hit. So I think barrel rate does a good job of telling you what percentage of the time the player had a good batted ball, essentially. Because say if you have a player, say it's May and some player's breaking out, he's performing way above your expectation, way above how he's performed the rest of his career. I think barrel rate's a good thing to look at to see if, okay, maybe he actually changed something and maybe he found a stride and we can expect to keep it going for the rest of the year, or maybe he is getting a little lucky at the plate and he's probably going to regress as time goes on. And maybe if you have him in fantasy, maybe you should look to sell high.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do want to talk a little bit about projections, since I do projections over at Fangraphs, the ATC projections. ATC is an aggregation projection model, but we don't have Derek Carty here to talk about his projections, so I'll fill in a little bit of details. But in making a projection system, there are three major components, three basic tenets, and they are regression to the mean, aging curves, and weighting of years. The most basic system that Tom Tango develops is called Marcel the Monkey forecasting system. And it basically says, if nothing else, if you're just a monkey going on a typewriter, you should at least be able to produce this. Like any projection system that's worse than this projection system stinks. In terms of regression, it means that we can't expect any performance outsized up or down of a player to continue forever. He'll always regress to his mean. Or if we don't even know of a mean, as far as Marcel, just the major league average mean. Like for Marcel specifically, any minor league player, they just assume is an average major league player. Aging curves, a player peaks at a certain age. Until then, he's going to trend up. After then, he's going to trend down. So you need to be able to take player performance and somehow progress it on the aging curve for the next year. It also takes weighting of years, meaning whatever data you have for past performance, the most recent year is accounted more than the next year, and 3 years ago is accounted even less than the both. Marcel uses 3 years, but other projection systems, you can use 4 years, 5 years, and so on and so forth. This year's it's more complicated this year because, every year in baseball, last couple of years, we had a different phenomenon. We had Spider Tech last year. We had the short season in 2020. 2019, we had Happy Fun Ball, as my colleague Jeff Zimmerman likes to say. So getting that actual right is a part of the challenge of projectors. And of course, then it's all the other fancy stuff on top of it. Derek Carty and the bat, he puts weather in. In Los Angeles, the weather is going to be different in June than it is in September. In Colorado, it could snow in April, and there's predictions based on the weather. He even puts umpires, like, Angel Hernandez is umpiring you. That has an effect on your called strikes. That, some really, really sophisticated stuff can be put in on top of use of X stats. Instead of batting average, throw some kind of X WOBA or X batting average or something in FIP instead of ER. You can improve it by certain things that are measured by components and stuff like that. Then in terms of building it all together, you're projecting a skill, which is a rate per plate appearance or per inning pitched. And then you multiply it by the playing time, which is even the hardest component to do. And you put them all together and you get a projection system. With my projection system, ATC, I don't do any of those things directly. I take other projection systems and I historically weight which projection system works a little bit better in certain statistics. Some projection systems, homers are much better modeled based on historical accomplishments. Sometimes pitcher strikeouts are better modeled in a different projection system, and I'll weight them together. And once I take the wisdom of crowds, it minimizes the parameter risk of, hey, what is the true talent of a player? Well, this model says one thing. How do you know it's it? But when I use the wisdom of the crowds, it helps me form a little bit better model. So it's a little bit about projections and how they're used. Guys, have anything to add about either making projections or maybe talk about using projections for you and maybe why they're important to use? Start with you, Siegel.
So I think the number one thing to remember about projections is that they're averages. If you just look at the ATC logo behind Ariel, like that's essentially the distribution of what a player's outcome can be. So obviously the longest bar is around where the player's average is, but there's still a lot of distribution that can be greater or less than that average. So basically, if I were to tell you that Shohei Ohtani is projected to hit 36 home runs this year. I don't know if that's an exact number. I just made that up. But that doesn't mean that if Shohei Ohtani hits 38 home runs, I'm wrong. That just means if I had the power to simulate the 2022 season 10,000 times, then on average, he'd hit 36 home runs. So I think that's the number one thing that people don't really understand about how projections work and what their purpose is.
Right. That's true. Frank?
Yeah, no, I think that was pretty much exactly what I was going to say. I think that so if you go and sort a projection system by, say, batting average for next year, and you see that, like the leader is supposed to hit 295, that doesn't mean that no one is going to hit 300. We have we think someone is definitely going to hit 300. We just don't know which player it's going to be. We're not saying the major league leader in home runs is only going to hit 33. We're just saying we're not confident enough in anyone to hit on average more than 33 home runs that it's hard to say for certain. Like, I think if you look at the distribution, we still expect someone to hit 45. We just don't know which one it's going to be. And guessing one person hit 45 and the other 30, if they flip, is going to be like a much stronger guess than if you have them both for 37 or whatever. I think I read on Twitter, I don't know who it was, but someone put it in terms of an elevator. So you have an elevator. So you're getting in an elevator in a hotel. There's that was you. Okay. Then I can let you say it if you want. I was probably the best. That was probably the best thing I've ever read in terms. Maybe I just read it when I was looking through your Twitter when we got paired together, but it was very profound.
Yeah. No, basically you're referring to the notion of that. Yeah, you're right that there's no player. The ATC projection system could say the highest guy is not 298, but that doesn't mean that we really think the highest guy in baseball is 298. It's the best guess for that particular player is 298, and the best guess at the next player is 297. And if you bet on the long-term average, you're going to be right more when you bet those numbers, which are a little bit more conservative. In a one-year season, there's going to be more volatility because there's 162 games, right? And, the elevator analogy there is that if you're in a lobby in an elevator, in a hotel, and there's two elevators, right? They're 20 feet apart. And you press the button to call the elevators. You don't know what floor they're on. Where do you stand? Do you stand next to the first one? Because that's a guess. Do you stand next to the second one? That's a guess. No, you stand in the middle because on average, that's where the elevators are going to be. And it minimizes risk, right? You don't have to walk now 20 feet on one way. You don't have to walk 20 feet the other way. It's just 10 overall. You're minimizing your long-term volatility by making the best guess. Even though there is no elevator bank right in the middle, that's just a wall, right? You wouldn't guess a wall, but it's the best guess in the long term. That's how the analogy works there. Great stuff. All right. It pretty much will wrap it up, other than a straight question or two. Why don't you guys just quickly plug any stuff you have, and we'll hand it back to Nick in just a minute or two. Frank, why don't you go first?
Oops, sorry, you cut out for a second. But yeah, I'm assuming you were wanting me to talk, so I will talk. You can follow me on Twitter at LB You can buy a couple of books I wrote about baseball stats. They're called Hidden Ball Trick, The Baseball Stats You Never Thought to Look For, available on Amazon. It's kind of a statistical look at the history of baseball. So it looks at each year and finds the best kind of back of the baseball card stats, kind of the most fun facts that you'd see on ESPN Stats and Info or whatever after the season's over. So kind of a really good look at history and learning about all the players through kind of a statistical lens. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, would definitely check it out in my pinned tweet at LB. But yeah, that's about it.
All right, yeah.
For me, as I mentioned earlier, you can follow me at Jersiegs. That's JERSIEGS. My pin tweet is actually a project that I worked on last off season about 90th percentile exit velocity. I have an article that I wrote about it, leaderboards for the last 6 seasons. Definitely would recommend checking that out if you haven't already. Also, stay tuned for more pitcher list data-driven articles in the future, especially once the season starts, or I guess I should say if the season starts, unfortunately.
When we'll be optimistic here at PitchCon when the season starts. Yeah, they're meeting at the same table, so that's definitely in the positive direction. My name's Ariel Cohen. I notably do the ATC Projections, which are out now on Fangraphs, on CBS Sportsline, and Rotobowler, where I write articles as well there. I do have my own podcast called the Beat the Shift Podcast, presented by Fangraphs. You can check that out. We do a lot of fantasy baseball strategy. We talk about players, but it's half the show is about how much waiver wire money to spend, when to drop a player, the ifs and whens and hows to construct your roster, and all that. And my Twitter handle, ATCNY. Nick, if you're there, I don't know if there's any stray question or two. Otherwise, we'll hand it back over to you.
What's going on? Fantastic panel, really. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really only have one question. Jeremy, is that a football that you're holding?
Oh, yeah, this is a football. Sorry.
You brought a football to a baseball conference?
I didn't even realize
You're
that
supposed to have a baseball.
Yeah, I know. I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't even realize that I was kind of just like, it's kind of like my, it's like a fidget spinner. It's just like a kind of thing. I didn't even realize that
next
you
year
guys
you'll
caught that.
you'll know.
But, yeah, my apologies. If you want to send me a baseball for next year, and I'll plug it.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do.
I'll plug the sport.
Clearly, that's the appropriate response. No, but I mean, one thing I am really curious about, and I don't want to go really quickly on it, if there's something that jumps out to you guys that's just kind of like your holy grail stat in some way, or if there's something you want to. I mean, Jeremy, you probably can't even say much of anything at the moment, but if there's something that's like, oh, you know what, I kind of want this question answered. Is there a certain one that any of you guys have that you're curious about?
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, do you have like a holy grail stat that you're searching to get the answer for?
Was that to me? I'm sorry.
Ariel, you
football
had
dude,
something
yes.
you're gonna say.
Yeah.
No, go for it, Ariel.
Well, anyways, yeah, I was going to say that, we mentioned about injury stuff. Any stat that you think that can detect changes in health or injury, like, oh, there's something notably, that's the most important thing. Because once you get is this something wrong, then it clues into everything. So
yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Jeremy, do you have anything? Or actually, sorry, Siegel. I understand why you're calling them Frank and Siegel now. I get it. Oh my God, a Siegel.
Yeah. I was going to say the exact same thing. So injuries are the most unpredictable thing that could happen in sports. Going back to our discussion about projections, about how projections are averages, in that distribution, part of it is that the player gets Tommy John surgery on the first pitch that they throw, or they blow out their elbow, they have to get Tommy John surgery on the first pitch they throw of the season, and they have 0 strikeouts, 0 innings pitched, 0 wins. And how can we predict that? And what can we do to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, that's great. And I know, Jeremy Frank, I don't know if you can answer anything, but is there something that's on your mind?
Yeah, no, I think that I'm a fan of defensive metrics, so I think the thing that I follow the most is the progress that those I've kind of mentioned earlier on the show, but every year I think we get a much better glimpse of how good a defender is compared to the year before. I know I think teams are a little bit ahead of us, but it's really fascinating when seeing new public research come out, because it's something that unlike hitting, it's really hard to look at someone and say, oh, this is a great defender or not, because a lot of times their eyes are really deceived by defense. If players are really bad at getting jumped, really good with their hands, they might look like a great defender when in reality their kind of skills kind of average each other out and they're kind of just a mediocre defender. So I think looking at it like an objective data-driven view, I think is really interesting to see how our discussions of players can kind of change over 10 years of new information coming out about them.
Yeah, I think this is essentially you saying like Derek Jeter did not deserve those Gold Gloves. And I also remember when I was contending that Wheeler versus Burns, and pretty much the whole Cy Young thought of earned runs and innings pitched. You made a really good point about how much defense is involved in that and how much that should be brought up. So it doesn't shock me that you're very interested in understanding better about team defenses in general. Cool. You guys rock. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I've gone past this, so Matt, I feel so terrible. You're in the wait and you're ready to go. So Ariel, Frank, and Siegel, I guess I got to do that. Thank you guys so much for being here. Really, you've made PitchCon so much better being here. Thank you.